The night Ellie Dawson was told she had 3 days to leave the only home she'd ever known, the first thing she thought about wasn't herself. It was her 5-year-old sister, Margot, asleep upstairs in the narrow cot they shared, clutching the rag doll their mother had sewn before the tuberculosis took her. Ellie stood in the kitchen of her Uncle Vernon's farmhouse in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, the winter of 1937, pressing against the window panes, and listened to the man who had grudgingly taken them in 2 years earlier finally say what his eyes had been saying all along. "I've done my Christian duty," Vernon said, not looking at her. He was a broad man with a sunburned neck and hands that were always clenched. "Fed you, housed you, but I got my own children to think about. Come spring planting, I need the room and I need the rations. You're 16 now, old enough to work for somebody else." Ellie's voice was steady, though her heart hammered beneath her ribs. "And Margot?" Vernon shifted in his chair. His wife, Aunt Ida, stood by the stove, wringing a dishcloth but saying nothing. "Margot can stay," he said slowly. "For now. She's young enough to be useful in a few years. But you've always been too much. Too many questions. Too many books. Too many ideas that don't belong to a girl with nothing to her name." It was true that Ellie read. She read everything. The almanacs stacked in the general store, the water-stained encyclopedias in the church basement, the agricultural pamphlets that arrived at the county extension office. She read about soil composition and root systems and the way French farmers in the Alps had built walapini greenhouses half buried in the earth to trap warmth through brutal winters. She read about women who had run entire farms alone during the Great War. She read because reading was the only door that nobody could lock against her. But none of that mattered to Vernon Dawson. What mattered was that Ellie was another mouth, another body, another reminder of his dead brother who'd married poorly and died young and left behind 2 girls that the whole town of Carverton regarded as burdens. 3 days. Ellie had 3 days to figure out how to survive and how to make sure Margot would be safe until she could come back for her. If you want to find out how a 16-year-old girl with nothing but a handful of books and a fierce love for her sister built something that an entire mountain community would come to depend on, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Ellie Dawson created in those cold mountains didn't just save her own life, it saved dozens of others, including the very people who turned their backs on her. Ellie spent those 3 days preparing, not weeping, not begging, preparing. She had learned long ago that tears bought nothing in Carverton, and begging only made people like Vernon feel powerful. Instead, she moved quietly through the house and the town, gathering what she could. She took the canvas rucksack that had been her father's. She took a hand axe, a coil of rope, a box of matches, and 3 wool blankets that Aunt Ida silently set on the porch when Vernon wasn't looking, the only kindness the woman had ever managed to smuggle past her husband's authority. She took seeds. This was the thing that would matter most, though Ellie didn't fully understand it yet. From the mason jars in the root cellar, she filled small cloth pouches with dried bean seeds, turnip seeds, kale seeds, and the hardy winter wheat her father had once cultivated. She took a handful of seed potatoes wrapped in newspaper. She took dried herbs, rosemary, thyme, chamomile, that her mother had hung from the kitchen rafters years ago, and that nobody had bothered to throw away. And she took books, 2 of them, borrowed permanently from the church basement where no one would notice their absence, a volume on Appalachian agriculture and a battered copy of a guide to root cellars and food preservation that had been published by the State Extension Service in 1921. On the morning of her departure, Ellie knelt beside Margot's cot. The little girl's eyes were wide and frightened. She understood enough to know that something terrible was happening, even if she couldn't grasp all of it. "Listen to me," Ellie whispered, smoothing Margot's dark hair. "I'm going to find us a place, a real place. And when it's ready, I'm coming back for you. You be brave, and you be quiet, and you do what Aunt Ida says. Can you do that?" Margot nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. She pressed the rag doll into Ellie's hands. "Take Mama," she said, "so you won't be alone." Ellie tucked the doll into her rucksack and walked out into the gray February morning without looking back, because she knew if she looked back, she would never leave. She walked north, into the mountains. Ellie had a destination in mind, though she hadn't told anyone about it. During her years of wandering the hills around Carverton, the wandering that Vernon and the town considered evidence of her laziness and oddness, she had discovered something remarkable about 4 miles up the North Ridge Trail, past the abandoned Harlan Timber Road, in a hollow where the mountain folded in on itself like cupped hands. There was a cabin. It wasn't much. A single-room structure built from hand-hewn chestnut logs, with a stone chimney that still drew, and a roof that was damaged, but not destroyed. It had been built, she'd learned from old Mrs. Perkins at the general store, by a man named Silas Whitmore, a trapper who had lived alone in the mountains for 30 years before vanishing one winter in the early 1920s. Nobody knew if he'd died or simply walked away. Nobody had claimed the land. It sat in a pocket of the mountain that was technically unincorporated, belonging to no one, wanted by no one, except Ellie. She had visited the cabin a dozen times over the past 2 years, each time studying it more carefully. The hollow where it sat was extraordinary. The mountain walls rose steeply on 3 sides, creating a natural windbreak. A spring emerged from the rock face on the eastern wall, feeding a small stream that ran through the hollow before disappearing underground again. The southern exposure was open, catching whatever winter sun the mountains allowed. And the soil was dark and rich, decades of leaf litter composting into something that smelled alive even in winter. It was the soil that had first made Ellie's mind race with possibility. She had read about microclimates, sheltered pockets where temperatures stayed warmer than the surrounding terrain. This hollow was exactly that. The rock walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The spring water, emerging from deep underground, never froze. Even in February, the hollow was noticeably warmer than the exposed ridge above. But reaching it in winter, alone, with a 30-pound pack, was a different matter than visiting on a summer afternoon. The trail up the ridge was iced over. Twice she slipped and fell hard, once gashing her shin on a rock so badly that blood soaked through her wool stocking. The wind above the tree line cut through her coat like it wasn't there. By the time she reached the Harlan Timber Road, her fingers were numb inside her gloves, and her teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue. She almost didn't make it. The final mile, descending into the hollow through dense rhododendron thickets, she lost the faint deer trail she'd always followed and spent an hour stumbling through undergrowth in fading light. When she finally saw the dark shape of the cabin against the gray rock wall, she was shaking so badly she could barely work the rusted latch. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark and smelled of mice and damp wood, but the walls were solid. The chimney, when she managed to start a fire with trembling hands, drew cleanly. She wrapped herself in all 3 blankets, pressed her back against the warm stones of the hearth, and ate a handful of dried beans raw because she was too exhausted to cook them. That first night, Ellie Dawson lay on the dirt floor of a dead man's cabin and made herself a promise. She would not just survive here. She would build something. Something warm and safe and growing. Something worthy of bringing Margot to. The first weeks were brutal beyond anything Ellie had imagined. She knew hardship. She had known it all her life. But there is a difference between the hardship of being unloved in a warm house and the hardship of being alone on a frozen mountain with inadequate food and shelter. She repaired the roof first, using fallen branches and sheets of bark stripped from dead hemlocks, sealed with a paste of mud and pine resin that she'd read about in the agricultural guide. The work took days in the cold, and her hands cracked and bled until she learned to wrap them in strips of cloth soaked in rendered animal fat she'd collected from the bones of a rabbit she trapped. She reinforced the door with additional planks salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding behind the cabin. She chinked the gaps between the logs with moss and clay from the stream bed, pressing the mixture into every crack with her fingers until the wind no longer whistled through the walls at night. The cabin would never be warm the way a proper house was warm, but it held enough heat from the fire to keep her alive, and that was enough. That had to be enough. Food was the urgent crisis. Her seed stores were for planting, not eating, and she rationed them fiercely. She survived the first month on foraged foods, dried rose hips she found clinging to bushes along the stream, hickory nuts cached by squirrels in a hollow tree, the inner bark of birch trees which she stripped and boiled into a bitter but sustaining broth, and occasional brook trout she pulled from the spring pool using a hook fashioned from a bent nail. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. There were mornings she woke so weak and dizzy that standing up required an act of will that frightened her. But the hunger sharpened something in her mind. It made every page she'd ever read about agriculture feel urgent and personal. She began planning, even as she fought to survive each day. The idea came to her fully formed on a morning in late March, when she noticed something about the hollow's southern slope. The rock face there was dark, almost black, and on sunny days it radiated warmth long after the sun had moved on. She pressed her palm against it one afternoon and felt heat stored in stone, and she remembered reading about the walapini, the sunken greenhouse technique used by farmers in Bolivia and adapted by mountain people around the world. She would dig into the hillside, not just a root cellar, though she would build one of those too. She would create an underground room, a bedroom for Margot, dug into the warm southern slope with a roof of glass salvaged from wherever she could find it, angled to catch the winter sun, a room that stayed warm without fire, a room that could grow things even in January, a secret room that no one would know about unless they were told. Ellie began digging on the first day of April, 1937, using the hand axe and a flat stone she'd shaped into a crude shovel. The soil on the southern slope was deep, years of mountain sediment, and beneath it was a layer of fractite clay that was dense but workable. She dug for hours every day, carrying soil out in the canvas rucksack, her shoulders screaming, her palms blistered raw. By May, she had excavated a space roughly 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 6 feet tall, carved into the hillside like a room scooped from the earth itself. The back and side walls were solid clay and stone, naturally insulated. The floor she packed with flat creek stones laid in sand for drainage. She lined the walls with layers of dried grass and bark for insulation, held in place by a lattice of woven willow branches. The roof was the engineering challenge. She needed something that would let in light, hold out rain, and trap heat. The answer came from an unlikely source. In June, Ellie made her first cautious trip back toward civilization, not to Carverton, but to the town of Elkridge, 8 miles to the west, where nobody knew her. She traded labor, 3 days of helping a farmer's wife with washing and mending, for permission to take the glass windows from an abandoned chicken house on the property. There were 6 panes, each about 2 feet square, some cracked, but none shattered. She carried them back to the hollow one at a time, wrapped in blankets, walking with agonizing care over the mountain trails. She built a frame of hewn oak, set at an angle matching the sun's winter arc, something she calculated using shadow measurements and information from the agricultural pamphlet. The glass panes were set into the frame, sealed with pine pitch and strips of cloth soaked in linseed oil she'd bartered for in Elkridge. The frame sat atop the excavated room at a 30-degree angle, facing due south. The effect was immediate and remarkable. Even on cool June evenings, the underground room held warmth like a stone oven. Sunlight poured through the glass, heated the stone floor and clay walls, and the thermal mass released that warmth slowly through the night. Ellie placed her hand against the back wall at midnight and felt it warm as a living thing. She built a small sleeping platform along one wall, framed with logs and topped with a mattress she stuffed with dried grass and cattail fluff. She built a shelf for books. She dreamed of filling it someday. She carved a small niche in the clay wall and set a candle in it, and when she lit it, the underground room glowed amber and gold, warm and close and secret. It was Margot's room. Everything Ellie did, she thought of Margot. But it was also, she realized, a greenhouse. The sunken floor, the glass roof, the thermal mass. It was exactly the walapini principle she'd read about. And so, she began to plant, along the base of the glass-covered slope, where light was strongest. She planted kale and turnip seeds in beds of composted leaf mold mixed with creek sand. Against the warm back wall, she planted beans, training them up strings attached to the ceiling frame. In clay pots she shaped and fired herself in the cabin's hearth. She started herb seedlings, the rosemary and thyme and chamomile from her mother's dried stores. Everything grew. In the protected, sun-warmed environment of the underground room, plants that would have died in the mountain frost flourished. By August, Ellie was eating fresh greens for the first time in months, and the hollow was beginning to look like something more than a survival camp. It was beginning to look like a home. It was in September of that year that Ellie met Abel Crawford. Abel was 73 years old, a retired school teacher who lived alone in a small house on the far side of the ridge. He had been a botany professor at a small college before the Depression eliminated his position, and he had retreated to the mountains with his books and his grief. His wife had died of pneumonia in 1934. He discovered Ellie's hollow by accident, following the stream to its source, and stood at the edge of the tree line, staring at the cabin, the underground greenhouse, and the 16-year-old girl hauling water from the spring with a look of absolute astonishment on his weathered face. "Who on God's green earth," he said slowly, "taught you to build a walapini?" Ellie straightened up, wary as a deer. "Nobody taught me. I read about it." Abel Crawford became Ellie's first friend, her teacher, and eventually the closest thing to a father she would ever know. He brought her books, real books on botany, soil science, cold climate agriculture. He brought her tools, a proper spade, a saw, a hammer, nails. He taught her things no book could. How to read the mountain weather by the behavior of birds, how to identify medicinal plants, how to graft fruit trees and propagate berries from cuttings. In return, Ellie shared her fierce energy and her underground greenhouse, and Abel marveled at what determination and a handful of pamphlets had produced. Together, over the autumn of 1937, they expanded. Ellie dug a second underground chamber, larger, dedicated entirely to food production. Abel helped her design a more sophisticated ventilation system using clay pipes that drew cool air from the stream bank and warm air from a simple composting heat source, manure and straw layered in a pit beside the greenhouse that generated steady warmth as it decomposed. They built raised beds along the glass-covered slope and filled them with a soil mixture Abel formulated from years of study: forest loam, creek sand, composted leaves, and wood ash from the cabin hearth. By the first anniversary of Ellie's banishment, the hollow contained the repaired cabin, 2 underground greenhouse rooms producing food year-round, a proper root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables, a chicken coop housing 6 hens that Abel had given her, a system of terraced garden beds climbing the hollow's walls, and a network of small irrigation channels fed by the spring. And in March of 1938, Ellie walked down to Carverton and brought Margot home. Aunt Ida didn't fight it. She stood on the porch and watched the 2 girls walk away and said only, "You take care of her." Whether it was relief or sorrow on her face, Ellie never knew and never asked. Margot's reaction to the underground bedroom was everything Ellie had dreamed of during those long months of digging and building. The little girl stood in the warm, amber-lit space with its glass ceiling showing mountain sky, its walls lined with growing green things, its small sleeping platform covered in quilts that Abel's wife had once made. And she turned to Ellie with eyes so wide they seemed to hold the whole room. "It's like a fairy house," Margot whispered, "a fairy house under the mountain." Ellie knelt and held her sister. "It's your house," she said. "Nobody can take it away." Word of Ellie's operation spread slowly, the way things do in mountain communities, through hunters who stumbled on the hollow, through Abel's occasional mentions at the Elk Ridge General Store, through the simple miracle of a teenage girl selling fresh greens and herbs at the Elk Ridge Market in January, when no one else had anything green to offer. People came to look. They came skeptical and left amazed. The underground greenhouses, there were 3 by 1939, were unlike anything the mountain people had seen. Lettuce and kale growing in December. Tomato seedlings started in February, months ahead of the outdoor season. Herbs available year-round. Root vegetables stored in the cellar lasting through the harshest winters. Families began asking Ellie to teach them. She did, freely and patiently, the way Abel taught her. She showed them how to select a south-facing slope, how to calculate the digging depth for their elevation, how to seal glass panes against weather, how to build composting heat systems. She gave away seeds and seedlings. She drew diagrams on brown paper bags and handed them out like prescriptions. By 1940, there were 7 walapini greenhouses operating in the hollows and hillsides within 10 miles of Ellie's cabin. Families who had been one bad winter away from starvation were growing food year-round. Children who had shown the swollen bellies of malnutrition were eating fresh vegetables in January. Abel Crawford died in the spring of 1941, peacefully, in the rocking chair on his porch with a book on alpine botany open on his lap. He left Ellie his entire library, 214 books, and the deed to his property, which he had quietly transferred to her name the year before. Ellie shelved every book on the shelf she had built in Margot's underground room, and she cried for the first time since leaving Vernon's farmhouse. The war years brought new challenges and new purpose. Young men left the mountains, and Ellie found herself teaching not just greenhouse techniques, but general agriculture, food preservation, and animal husbandry to the women, children, and elderly who remained. Her network of underground greenhouses expanded to 15, then 20. The county extension agent, a young woman named Dorothy Hale, who had initially been skeptical of what she called that cave garden nonsense, visited Ellie's operation in 1943 and left so impressed that she wrote a report to the state agricultural office recommending Ellie's techniques for wider adoption. It was in the winter of 1944 that the blizzard came. They called it the Valentine storm. It struck on February 12th and didn't release the mountains until February 19th. 7 days of continuous snowfall, wind gusts exceeding 60 miles an hour, temperatures dropping to 28 below zero. It was the worst blizzard in the Blue Ridge in living memory. Ellie's cabin, sturdy as she had made it, couldn't withstand the full fury of the storm. On the third night, the weight of snow collapsed a section of the roof. Wind and snow poured in, extinguishing the fire and dropping the temperature inside to dangerous levels within an hour. Ellie grabbed Margot, now 12, but still small for her age, and their blankets and food stores and descended into the underground bedroom that Ellie had built 7 years earlier for exactly this kind of desperate love. They lived underground for 5 days. The walapini held. The glass roof, angled steeply and reinforced with oak crossbeams Abel had helped her install, shed the snow load. The thermal mass of the stone floor and clay walls maintained a temperature above 40 degrees, even as the world above froze. The plants kept producing oxygen. The root vegetables stored along the back wall kept them fed. The spring water, entering through a clay pipe Ellie had installed, kept flowing because it came from deep enough underground that no surface freeze could stop it. When the storm broke on February 19th, Ellie dug them out through 4 feet of snow and stood blinking in pale sunlight. Across the mountains, the devastation was severe. Livestock had frozen in barns, pipes had burst, homes had been damaged. 3 people in the county had died of exposure. But every single walapini greenhouse, all 23 of them, had survived intact. The families who had built them following Ellie's designs had sheltered in them, just as Ellie had. The underground structures, insulated by the earth itself, had been fortresses against the storm. Vernon Dawson's farmhouse had not fared as well. The storm had collapsed his barn, killed most of his livestock, and damaged his house badly enough that the family was living in the church basement in Carverton when Ellie heard about it. She went to him. She didn't go to gloat or to demand acknowledgement. She went because Vernon had 3 children, Ellie's cousins, and they were hungry, and Ellie had food. She brought baskets of preserved vegetables, fresh greens from the greenhouse, eggs from her hens, and dried herbs. She brought them to the church basement and set them on the table in front of Vernon without a word about the past. Vernon looked at the food, and then he looked at his niece. This young woman with calloused hands and clear eyes who he had sent into the winter 7 years ago. And something in his face broke open. "I was wrong," he said. It was the only time he ever said it, and it was enough. Ellie helped Vernon rebuild. She taught him how to build a walapini beside his new barn. She gave him seeds and seedlings and showed his children how to tend them. She did this not because Vernon deserved it, but because his children did, and because the girl who had once been sent away with nothing had learned that abundance is only meaningful when it is shared. The story of the Valentine storm and the walapini greenhouses spread far beyond the mountain hollows. A reporter from the Roanoke Times drove up in the spring of 1944 to see the greenhouses for himself. He expected to find a curiosity, some backwoods novelty. Instead, he found a network of engineered underground growing spaces, a cooperative of families who had weathered the worst blizzard in 50 years without losing a single person, and a young woman who could explain the principles of thermal mass and passive solar heating with the confidence of a university professor while standing in her muddy boots beside a stream. His article, published in April 1944, under the headline, "Mountain Girls' Underground Gardens Defy Winter's Worst," brought visitors from as far away as Richmond and Washington. In 1946, Ellie married a man named Thomas Whelan, a returning soldier who had grown up on a farm in the Shenandoah Valley and who understood, the first time he saw Ellie's underground greenhouses, that he was looking at something both ancient and revolutionary. Thomas was quiet and steady and strong, and he loved Ellie not in spite of her fierce independence, but because of it. Together, they expanded the operation into what became known as the Dawson Mountain Agricultural Cooperative, a network of 57 underground and semi-underground greenhouses spread across 3 counties, providing year-round food production in a region where winter had always meant scarcity. Margot grew up in the Hollow, attended school in Elkridge, and eventually became a school teacher herself, the first person in the Dawson family to attend college, funded by the cooperative's growing success. She never forgot the underground room. Years later, she would tell her own students about the sister who had dug a bedroom out of a mountain, because love is not an abstraction. It is a shovel and sore hands and glass panes carried one at a time over a frozen ridge. Ellie and Thomas had 4 children, all of whom were raised in the Hollow. The cabin was expanded into a proper farmhouse, but the original underground rooms were preserved, still growing food, still warm, still lit with amber candlelight on winter evenings. Ellie Dawson Whelan died on October 3, 1998, at the age of 77, in the farmhouse that had begun as a trapper's abandoned cabin. She died in autumn, which felt right, the season of harvest, of gathering in, of preparing for what comes next. By then, the cooperative she had founded served over 200 families. The walapini technique she had adapted for Appalachian conditions had been written about in agricultural journals and adopted by mountain communities from West Virginia to Vermont. A version of her original underground greenhouse design was being taught by the Extension Service as a standard method for cold climate food production. At her funeral, held in the Hollow on a golden October afternoon, Margot stood beside the glass-roofed room that had been built for her when she was 5 years old and read a passage from one of Abel Crawford's botany books that Ellie had loved. The underground bedroom was still warm. The herbs along its walls, descendants of the plants their mother had dried and hung from kitchen rafters 60 years earlier, were still growing. 300 people attended. Many of them owed their livelihoods, their health, their children's nutrition to the techniques a banished 16-year-old girl had pulled from the pages of pamphlets and books and the depths of her own refusal to be defeated. What does it mean to build something in the dark? What does it mean to dig into the cold earth and create warmth where none existed? Ellie Dawson was not a scientist or an engineer or a woman of means. She was a girl who loved her sister, who read everything she could get her hands on, and who decided that being cast out was not the same as being destroyed. She took the qualities that her world called flaws, her curiosity, her restlessness, her refusal to accept the way things were, and she turned them into tools. She dug a room in the earth because she wanted her sister to be warm, and in doing so, she discovered a way to feed an entire region. If you have ever been told that you are too much, too curious, too restless, too unwilling to accept the limits others place on you, then perhaps Ellie's story is your story too. Perhaps the very thing that makes you difficult is the thing that will make you extraordinary. Perhaps the place you are being sent away from is not the place where your life happens. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the greatest achievements don't begin with advantage or opportunity. They begin with a girl, a shovel, and an unshakable belief that love is something you build with your hands.